Hey there everybody, it's Mark Crowley. I'm back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about 7 different types of writers, categories that are basically built around the idea of how much do you plan out your story before you start writing. And right up top I want to tip my hat to Cheyenne, I hope I'm saying her name right, Cheyenne A. Lepka. Whose tweet back in May inspired me to attempt to come up with categories of my own. She came up with 9 different categories of writers, and highly detailed. She really clearly had put a lot of thought into it, and I'm going to link to her tweet, which will allow you to see these 9 different categories and all the different sort of descriptions that she came up with. For the different categories. It got me wondering, boy, have other people come up with such lists? And sure enough, as you look through Google, you'll see that a lot of people have attempted to categorize different writers based on the degree to which they plan their stories out in advance, or do they just sort of make them up on the fly. And I thought, well, maybe I can come up with my little system of categories. I came up with 7. As I said, Cheyenne came up with 9, and I do encourage you to follow the link. I'm putting a link to her tweet in the description of this video. Go give her a follow and see what she came up with, because I am indebted to her for the basic idea of even thinking of doing a video like this. That being said, let's go ahead and get on with my my categories that I came up with, as I said, inspired by Cheyenne. And the first one, number 1, I call stream of consciousness. You just start writing with no plan at all and see where it goes. And in a way, what I've done is come up with a kind of spectrum here, with this being the one far side of the spectrum, the person who truly has no plan at all. Just start writing things, see what happens. One thing leads to another, and that allows you to begin writing a story. Now, I don't know if I've ever written a story this way myself. I usually have at least some kernel of an idea, but I know that there are some people who believe so much in spontaneity that they really don't want to contaminate the muse in a way. They don't want to think anything out in advance. They just want it all to come naturally, one sentence at a time almost, flowing from the mind. And, I'm sure a lot of great stories have come from that approach, indeed from all of these different approaches. But let's move on to the next one as we begin to move across the spectrum of different approaches. Number 2, make it up as you go. You have a kernel of a story idea / the basic premise, but beyond that, everything is invented from one scene to the next. So here we start to firm things up a little bit, I guess, in terms of having a kernel of an idea. And I certainly have done stories like that. In fact, my very first story probably would fit into this category. If I had the kernel of an idea of a little girl named Akiko going to another planet, and I hadn't worked anything else out, and I just sort of went from page by page, and it ended up being a nice, whimsical story. In fact, it launched my career. So that certainly is a viable way of doing things, and it does sort of maximize the spontaneity while freeing you from, for some people, I think, the terror of looking at a blank page and having absolutely no idea what you're going to write. I don't think I could work that way, but everyone has their own forms of inspiration. So anyway, I personally can vouch for this approach of making it up as you go. Although what it may end up meaning is that you have written a first draft, and you have to go back after you've, all this stuff has sort of spilled out from one scene to the next, and then later on edit and change things and get rid of things that don't make sense and so forth. So I suspect for a lot of people there is a lot of editing using these early approaches where you just make it up as you go. I should say that in case it's not obvious, which I think it is, I decided to draw Jasmine from Aladdin because of the live-action Aladdin movie that just came out. I still haven't seen this live-action version, but I was a big fan of the animated classic. I saw it in the theaters when it first came out. back in the early 90s. And so I thought, here's a good excuse for me to draw Jasmine. Let's keep going. I am going to move on to my third category now. Character focused. You don't necessarily have a story idea, but you have a character, or multiple characters, and you allow writing about the characters to lead you to a story. So I wanted to get at least one category in here that was all about the characters and how, for a lot of people, that's really how they write. And it seems to me that if you have a character that you love and it's a really interesting character, you are on your way to not just one story, but maybe multiple stories, because you love this character, and they might have lots of different adventures or lots of different things that happen to them. And to me, that it begins to feel maybe like it might be a good television show idea. Very often a television show is built around a character. But certainly a lot of young reader novels, or even, like Sherlock Holmes, these books for grown-ups, built around a character, and seeing what happens, from one story to the next with the consistency of this character that we really get to know over a series of stories. I myself, I don't think I've ever done that. I don't think I've ever written a story that really flowed 100% from the character, and maybe that's why some of the characters in my stories are not such, strikingly unusual, quirky characters. I tend to have characters that are a little more of a blank slate, a stand-in, let's say, for the reader. And I try to make them interesting and believable, but they are rarely super quirky and oddballs or misfits. Then I've very rarely written a story that features characters like that. So it's interesting to think that these categories may lead you towards certain types of stories. I do think that someone who tends to be character focused, probably, as you would expect, comes up with really great characters. We haven't gotten to my category yet. We're going to, and I'll point it out when we get there, but I'm more of a plot guy, and so it tends to be more about the premise and the plot. Let's move on, though, to this next category, number 4. World-focused. You don't necessarily have a story idea, but you've imagined a world in considerable detail, and you allow writing about that world to lead you to a story. So this is sort of like, a pair with this one about the character-focused, world-focused. And some people, I think, do begin their story because they've got this world that they want to write about. Now, it could be a sci-fi world, a fantasy world. It could be a historical period. Maybe you're fascinated by the Civil War, let's say, in America, or the ancient Rome, or something like that. I think that someone might really spend all their time researching this historical period, and so they know the world, the sort of historical world that they want their story to take place in, and that's what gets them going and eventually leads them towards characters and a plot and so forth. Again, I don't think I've ever done one that works this way. Maybe the closest would be that first Akiko story, in the sense that I invented a planet called the planet Smoo. And that sort of led me to a certain vibe for the story. It was this whimsical kind of Wizard of Oz type of planet. And so I suppose the world played a bigger role in that story than it has in some of the other ones. Brody's Ghost is set in a dystopian, futuristic city. I didn't even come up with that aspect until relatively late in the development process. It could have taken place in the present day. And it was while I was sort of planning things out and trying to figure out how do I make this project more interesting for me as a creative person, that I hit upon setting it in the near future. And I found that it worked in terms of other aspects of the plot. So there you go. Let's see, I'm interested to hear, or to read in the comments section, which category do you fit into? Do you see yourself fitting into as you hear about these one after the other? I should probably take a break right now, and in time-lapse I'm going to go ahead and sort of get a little more work done on this illustration of Jasmine. We'll get a little closer to completion, and then I will be back to reveal the final 3 categories in my system. Well, I think we've got enough of this done that I can carry on with the final 3 categories. And this one is number 5. Figure out the premise and the ending. You've got a clear story idea. You know how it starts, and then you make sure you've got some idea for the ending before you start writing. So I have definitely begun to work out my ending for any story long before I get started with the writing. I think there's certainly good reasons to think through your ending. If you just hope to come up with a good ending somewhere along the way, you are throwing the dice, and kind of gambling a little bit with your time, because you just never know. You might not come up with a good idea along the way, and you may indeed have painted yourself into a corner. So again, I don't mean to say everyone ought to be, organized this way, but just to say there are solid reasons for trying to work out your ending before you commit too much time to the project. Then again, some people might argue, how can you envision a good ending before you've started writing? And I can see where some people would object to that and say, you don't know enough about your characters or your story or whatever to devise a natural ending so early in the process. So here I am arguing both sides of the issue, but as you can tell, I have come down into these final categories of being a little more organized and trying to think things out prior to getting underway with the real work of writing actual scenes and dialogue and all that stuff. So let us move on now to number 6. Loose outline. You've got the basics of the entire story in place in the form of an outline before you start writing. You are fairly committed to your plan, but you incorporate new ideas as they come to you during the writing process, sometimes making significant changes. And this is my category. This is my style for almost any story I write these days. I make an outline. And the outline may end up being a number of pages long, depending on how long the story is. But I'm not writing full scenes. I'm sort of describing the scenes and what I imagine needs to take place in those scenes. And so I call it a loose outline. It really is not getting too much into the nitty-gritty details of the story. I describe it as trying to see your story from way up high. It's almost as if you're in a helicopter looking down on your story. You don't see the details yet, but you see the entire story from beginning to end in broad strokes. But it's loose enough that as you come down, in my analogy here from your helicopter, you come down to the ground, you begin writing, you enter the room, you envision the scene, and start getting into all those details. You've kept it loose enough that when a new idea comes to you, a better idea than what you first had, you are still able to work it in because you haven't committed so much to any one of these little blurb descriptions of scenes, So yeah, this is, as you can tell, it's almost like I'm selling the approach to you, but this is the logic of why I've settled on this way. I like knowing my ending. I like knowing all the key scenes. But I also know from experience that you're not going to come up with all of your best ideas at the beginning. Sometimes a really good idea won't come to you until relatively late. And if you've kept it loose and you haven't hammered everything down and determined to stick with your outline every inch of the way, then you have the possibility of working in fresh ideas along the way. And my final category, number 7, detailed rock-solid outline. We've come to the opposite extreme from my very first one, which was the stream of consciousness, the sort of spectrum that I described for you. This is the opposite extreme here. You've worked the entirety of the plot out in considerable detail before you begin writing. The finished story follows this outline every step of the way, everything unfolding precisely as you envisioned it. And you can probably tell that I have never gone quite that far with my outlines. But my understanding is that, people who are going to make a Hollywood movie or whatever, they need to work everything out, Not every time, but ideally you've got everything, all that story stuff hammered out in advance so that you're not having to make up things on the fly. I mean, it's very expensive to make a movie. You don't want to be reshooting the entire third act because you, didn't know what the third act was going to be, although you'll hear stories about that in films, great classic films that were made that way. I would say these days most people want it all worked out in advance. And the only thing that is spontaneous is maybe occasional little bits of improvised dialogue. And again, I would say there's a difference between writing an outline and writing all the scenes, including the dialogue. At that point, you're no longer writing an outline, you're writing the story. When you get, but in my, I told you about how I'm like number 6 and I do the loose outline. I do sometimes throw in a sort of imagined line of dialogue here or there throughout my loose outline as these lines of dialogue pop into my head. Of course, I'm certainly not committed to any of those specific lines of dialogue at that stage. But there you go. Those are my 7 little categories. Please, leave a comment to tell me which category do you fit into, or do you indeed need to combine different aspects of the different categories to account for your approach. I'm really interested in reading what you have to say. And again, I want to say thank you to Cheyenne A. Lepka. Please do follow that link and go follow her on Twitter and support her, because she really came up with a brilliant categorization system there. And in a way, you could think of mine as like the beginner's version and hers as the advanced version, because she really put a lot of thought into it and wrote out in considerable detail what she sees as emblematic of these various types of writer. But I think it's now time for me to say thank you to anyone who has chosen to support me by getting any of my books, like Brody's Ghosts. My graphic novel series definitely worked this one out, beginning to end, in loose form, as I said. The Drawing Lesson, this one as well. All my stories these days are mapped out pretty well in advance. And Mastering Manga, not a book about writing, but there is some storytelling stuff in here for those of you who want to learn about creating graphic novels. But I do think it's time for me to lay down this pencil. Or should I add blushies? Should I add blushies? Okay, let's add blushies. I was just going to lay down the pencil, but then I thought, no, the blushy police will come after me. I don't know if I've ever seen Jasmine with blushies. This may be a mistake. Forgive me, Jasmine. I guess Jasmine gets the blushies every once in a while. We all do. Come on. We're only human. Okay, now I'm going to lay down this pencil. I want to thank you all for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back with another one real soon.